Hi BookTube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm gonna talk about two books that I read for an event that goes on in the month of May every year. The event is called Maybe Midrash, where you read usually one work of non-fiction and one work of fiction, both connected to sort of religion in some kind of way. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religious book, but it might be looking into the subject of religion. And I picked up two books, they're both sort of immediately recognisable as being quite religious. The first being Paradise Lost by Milton, and the second being C.G. Jung's Answers to Job. So both of these, but both of these in their own way being a kind of interpretation and a sort of rehashing of biblical stories. And the word midrash that is used, that Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse, the creator of the event, that word midrash is a word used in Judaism, sort of about kind of interpreting and having a conversation that's not particularly dogmatic necessarily, but it's taking religious ideas and tenets and stories and whatever it may be, and talking about them and hashing them out and trying to work out what we think of them, and that's the kind of that's the spirit of the event. The idea is not necessarily to try to find any answers or sort of anything like that, but rather just to explore and to have a bit of a think and to see what interpretations you can find out there, I suppose, but also then to reflect on it and see what your own interpretations may be. Not necessarily about religion, maybe just about the books themselves, which is really what I'm going to be talking about in this. Although by nature it's going to be quite religious, I suppose. So I'll start off with Paradise Lost. I'm not going to be promising a particularly in-depth review or anything like that, or a kind of clickbaity video where it's watch this before you read Milton. I'm not going to be telling you everything about the poem. This is just a reader's reaction to one reading of it. So I think I'd have to read it a few times and write copious notes to present a video like this. But here we go. This is to begin with Paradise Lost, which, to begin with, it is just amazing, just on a poetic level, on just how it sounds and feels as you're reading it. I do think it is rather amazing. It is really interesting to think of it in its historical context, to think of how it fits into the English Civil Wars and Milton's ideas of republicanism. There's an interesting tension there in the poem itself that people often talk about. So there's a small handful of things that I want to talk about. I'll give you a rough outline of the poem, just in case you don't have a rough idea of what it's about and what happens in Paradise Lost. And then I should have written these down, really, but I will talk about, I think first and foremost, with what people talk about in the poem, the character of Satan, who is a big character. He's one of the main characters, maybe the main character in Paradise Lost. So we'll talk about Satan and some of the maybe conflicting and odd ideas going on in Paradise Lost. We'll talk about Milton's ideas of God, or at least my interpretations of how God and the Godhead is represented in the poem. And then we'll have a quick look at humanity as well, and sort of human agency. And then we'll see where it goes from there. So to start off with a rough outline of the whole of Paradise Lost. It begins with war in heaven. It begins with Satan and the other fallen angels being exiled from heaven and falling down into hell. We don't really, if I'm remembering correctly, we don't really see much of that battle in the first book of Paradise Lost. It's made out of it's sort of written in a number of books, in 12 books. But later on we get a bit of a rehashing of it, and we get a bit more detail about how it was fought and what it looked like. And it begins with Satan and the other fallen angels finding themselves in hell and wondering what to do next. And I think a lot of people, this is what they, it's what you first encounter, and a lot of people really enjoy it, and then the tone kind of shifts because we have to move away from Satan and get a different picture. But there's all this wonderful rhetoric going in here, this wonderful, really quite political and quite persuasive rhetoric from Satan that I don't think is it's not misplaced at all. I think it is supposed to be there. I don't think he's mistakenly making Satan so persuasive and so almost likable, I suppose. I think he's almost like it reminded me of Mark Antony in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, in his funeral speech, and the way he's able, just through his rhetoric and the power of his rhetoric, turn the crowd against Brutus. I think there's a very similar kind of energy and power going on in Satan's use of language, and I think that potentially may be a particular point maybe that Milton was trying to make. I don't think it's not quite so simple maybe as what people say, but at least that's my take. I think the point is that Satan is supposed to be persuasive, and I think a lot of the characteristics of the sort of situations people are in, that they're there because Milton has had to frame this as an epic poem and has decided to take all these routes, and they have to get to certain places and do certain things, and then famously, eventually, the devil, as the serpent, is going to tempt Eve and Adam, and then humanity is going to fall. So it's kind of important that that Satan as a character is persuasive and is likable, because they're qualities that he's going to have to show to the other characters in the poem, because that's sort of the narrative function that he serves in there. As to whether it gets away from him, I think this is what people often say with Milton and with Paradise Lost, that Satan kind of gets away from Milton and he just becomes the star of the show almost, that he's just so he's so powerful in his use of language, sort of comparable to Milton himself, and you feel sympathy as well, which again, is that an accident? Did Milton go too far, or was it something intentional that he was doing? What was there a point he was making? I'm not too sure, but it is fascinating to think about that, and we'll get back to some of the other characteristics of Satan in a bit, as some of the other interpretations and ramifications of what Satan's like. But then moving on, so that he's in hell and he has to use his rhetoric to persuade the other fallen angels, and he, he basically is their leader, and there is this sense that they are a kind of parliament, and yet he really is running the show from the beginning. One of the other fallen angels informs him that he'd heard before they'd been expelled from heaven that God is about to create this whole new realm, and that he's going to people it with people, and so their plan is, well, they haven't been able to take heaven, they've been thrown into hell, maybe they can take the new realm. So they need to send out a scout, someone to check it out and see what they can do, and so Satan is sort of elected to go out, and on his way out there at the gates of hell, he somehow manages, I can't remember the exact details of how it works, but he ends up having two children. One is created first. I'm trying to remember she's called Sin, and then he has an incestuous child with Sin, sort of immediately, called Death, and then they're waiting after he's left at the gates of hell, and later in the poem, after the fall, they're loosed from hell, and it's this sort of allegorical thing from them. Sin and death have been loosed upon the world, so it's not subtle at all. And then he goes out to scout it, and some of the other angels are they sort of work out what's going on, and they're on the lookout for him. All the while as this is going on, sort of God, I suppose God the Father, has sort of worked out what's going on, and has realised that Satan is a threat to his new creation, to humanity, to Adam and Eve, and so he wants to, give them every chance that they have, and he, sends archangels out to help them and to guide them and to look for Satan, and then we have Adam and Eve and a picture of what their life is like in Eden. And then this long section in the middle where they're talking with which is it, Uriel, or I think it's Uriel, one of the archangels, and that's when we get a better picture of the war in heaven, and of why the fallen angels revolted, and essentially because the Son of God, the sort of second person of the Trinity, is being exalted, and so there's a sort of jealousy there that suddenly comes up in them, and then it's essentially there's this very deterministic view of the world and everything that's going to happen. God kind of already knows that humanity is going to fall, and that the Son of God has this conversation, and volunteers to be the redemption for humankind, and so already in the sort of Christian narrative, we've already got the story of Jesus kind of set up before the fall has already happened. And so God already knows there's going to be a fall, and God already knows that long after the fall there is going to be redemption, and that's a whole different poem eventually. That's Paradise Found. But I find it very intriguing, and knowing this, God still gives them every chance to respond, to fight off temptation, and And there's this little niggling thing in my head, like just trying to wonder what is Milton trying to say, and what is Milton presenting as well. Is it that God is definitely seeing this as the way it's going to go, or is he presenting an idea of God where God can see every possible outcome, and that's where it gets a bit Borgesian, and you have your forking paths, and that you can see that, you know, Satan has left hell and is scouting the earth, the new creation, to scupper it and to take it over. And so we've seen, you know, that is the situation, and so he sort of worked out all of the possible outcomes, and despite seeing very clearly that the most, you know, the outcome that is being dwelt on in the poem is that humanity will fall. Is he giving humanity every chance because he can see the other forks, or is it that despite the inevitability of what's going to happen, there's still a value on free will, even in a deterministic universe? So I don't know, that's sort of the weird spinning ball going around in my head about the idea of God and what God can see and what God chooses to see and act on in the poem. So yeah, it's interesting. And then going on from that, with that in the back of your head, as Adam and Eve are talking with this archangel, this archangel tells them not only what they've already experienced, but with a wider view of the creation. But they're told of the generations after them, through to Noah's flood, and then a brief overview of essentially all of biblical history, right up to the crucifixion, and mankind's redemption. Again, it's intriguing to see that, and to see, or actually, am I getting things muddled up? It might be that I'm getting things muddled up. It might be that vision is given to them as a consolation after the fall. I think that is the case. I think they're given stuff that happens before, but then after the fall, there's another sort of consultation with one of the angels, and the angel, as an act of mercy, lets them know everything that's going to happen, and despite the world being a terrible place, they're given plenty of reasons to hope. So that's a rough outline. There's other plot elements that I could go into with how Adam and Eve interact. Certain elements, I suppose, with the interaction, which very much, I think, showing the period that Milton was writing, and thoughts about a woman's place is not necessarily, to say that his source material is, quite short, really. You can read it in 5 minutes, the first few chapters of Genesis, and so there's a lot of room for, I think, for interpretation, and for trying to think of the right word. Anyway, in a certain sense, it's very easy to take from Milton this whole idea that the fall was, to a certain sense, Eve's fault, or that Adam and Eve had to be separated at the moment of the fall because Eve was inherently weaker than Adam, and then Adam is, in fact, it's almost, I'd have to get the text from Genesis up, which I'm not particularly well prepared for the video, but I seem to remember, that in Genesis they sort of both see, Eve sees that the fruit looks good and tastes good, and she eats it, and then she shows it to Adam, and he also sees that it's desirous and he wants to eat it. If I'm remembering correctly, that's how the text is sort of phrased in Genesis. Whereas in Paradise Lost, again, just Milton and his own interpretation of it, he feels like he has to make Eve weaker, and that Adam couldn't possibly be eating the apple out of temptation. Instead, it's out of a kind of despair, and that he's heard from God that if you eat of this fruit, you'll surely die. And they both intuit from that they're going to die immediately. And so he's seen that Eve has eaten it, and she's his companion. And so it's this sort of tragic love kind of thing where he's like, well, I'm going to perish with you and eat the fruit as well. And so that's kind of how the fall goes down in there. And again, I'm not sure what I think of that. He's certainly making his own point there. But that's a rough outline and a few random thoughts about Paradise Lost. Going on in there to think a little bit about Satan and God, and I think I've already gone over a few of the things that stood out to me as I was reading them. Think a little bit about the political dimensions of the poem, and a rough, simple sketch, I suppose, of the political interpretation of the poem. Milton himself being a Republican, of sort of honouring the virtues of democracy, of not wanting a monarch, and instead being a parliamentarian, and yet the narrative that is often given then in Paradise Lost is this idea of God being the tyrannical monarch, and then Satan being the rebellious Republicans. So and then people sort of drawing out the picture that Milton must be on politically on Satan's side, and he's compromised, and this is sort of religiously he wants to be on God's side, but politically he's on Satan's side. Which again, maybe that's his own point on human nature. Maybe he is, trying to make a point that naturally we're more on on Satan's side. Maybe he was a bit of a pessimist, but I found it intriguing that at the beginning of book 2 of the poem, this is what we have. High on a throne of royal state, which far outshone the wealth of Ormus and of Ind, where the gorgeous East with richest hands showers her kings barbaric pearl and gold, Satan exalted sat, by merit raised to that bad eminence, and from despair thus high uplifted beyond hope, aspires beyond thus high, insatiate to pursue vain war with heaven, and by success untaught his proud imaginations thus displayed. And then he goes on in a speech to the other demons in hell. And so is Satan really the Republican? He is rebellious. He is he does fight against a God who sort of through reading the poem with this sort of political frame, it's sort of perfectly reasonable to see how how God could be seen as a tyrannical monarch, and yet the sort of complex picture that I think Milton is kind of painting, whether intentionally or not, is the idea that what you might fight against might be the thing that you become, whether it's directed at the interregnum and at Cromwell or not, I'm not sure, but it's an interesting thing to think about with with power, and when you fight against a particular regime, you may then become, sort of mirror image of that regime instead of, sort of something entirely different and new. He's there as a monarch on a throne. And so I just found that interesting that language was still there, because there is also parliamentary language in there. So I found that really, really interesting to do with the sort of political power dynamic between Satan and God. And so that's I think generally all I have to say about it. I thought I'd read you just the end, just the last few lines of Paradise Lost, because I thought that they were really, really lovely, and it's just describing Adam and Eve as they're leaving the Garden of Eden after they've been speaking with one of the angels. So Eve has just said something, but then, so spake our mother Eve, and Adam heard, well pleased, but answered not. For now too nigh the archangel stood. I think Eve has just persuaded Adam not to kill himself because of the fall. For now too high the archangel stood, and from the other hill to their fixed station, all in bright array the cherubim descended. On the ground gliding meteorous as evening mist, risen from a river, all the marish glides, and gathers round fast at the labourer's heel, homeward returning. High in front advanced the brandished sword of God before them blazed, fierce as a comet, which with torrid heat and vapour, as the Libyan air adust, began to parch the temperate clime, whereat in either hand the hastening angel caught our lingering parents, and to the eastern gate led them direct, and down the cliff as fast to the subjected plain, then disappeared. They, looking back, all the eastern side beheld of paradise, so late their happy seat, waved over by that flaming brand, the gate with dreadful faces thronged and fiery arms. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They, hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. Just those last two lines. They, hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. And you've got that just perfect mix of tragedy and hope in there, that they're together, and yet part of what's been lost is their relationship as well, that their relationship with each other has also been affected, and that although they're together, they're forever kind of alone as well and separated from each other. So I thought that was really beautiful. So yeah, there are some rambling thoughts on Paradise Lost. I've rambled on for half an hour, and to be fair, I don't really know how much I can talk about the answer to Job other than saying it's one of the weirdest things I've ever read. I think I'm just going to start from the introduction and go from there. In the introduction, the editor, who is our editor here, Sonu Shamdasani is our editor, and he is given us a picture of the circumstances under which this book was written. So let's go in. So, in the winter of 1913, Jung embarked on a process of self-experimentation. He, and in case you're not aware of who he is, Jung was a psychoanalyst. I think he'd spent some time training with Freud, but sort of forked off into his own tradition, his own sort of way of seeing things. So in that time, Jung embarked on a process of self-experimentation. He deliberately gave free rein to his fantasy thinking and carefully noted what ensued. He later called this process active imagination. He wrote down these fantasies in the Black Books. These are not personal diaries, but rather the records of a self-experimentation. The dialogues that form these active imaginations can be regarded as a type of thinking in dramatic form. And essentially, going on from there, trying to remember where it goes into it a little more. Essentially, as part of this experimentation that he's doing in these writings that he's writing, he has this sort of critical moment, I suppose, this sort of, not quite a crisis, where he has a new vision of God, which I think, if I'm reading this whole book correctly, is really a new vision of himself and of how humanity sees itself. And he tries to express that in answer to Job. And I think part of me, I just don't really understand it. To be fair to Jung, I think he says in his own introduction, in what follows I shall attempt just such a discussion, such as a coming to terms with certain religious traditions and ideas. Since I shall be dealing with numerous factors, my feeling is challenged quite as much as my intellect. I cannot therefore write in a coolly objective manner, but must allow my emotional subjectivity to break if I want to describe what I feel when I read certain books of the Bible, or when I remember the impressions I have received from the doctrines of our faith. I do not write as a biblical scholar, which I am not, but as a layman and physician who has been privileged to see deeply into the psychic life of many people. What I am expressing is first of all my own personal view, but I know that I also speak in the name of many who have had similar experiences. I do sometimes get a little annoyed by his use of the word physician, and at least in sort of some of the context in here. But what Jung is essentially presenting in the book is he's sort of looking at towards the end of the book of Job, where there's almost a confrontation between Job and God, and essentially God is almost putting Job on trial, and is really showing the gulf between humanity and him, and himself. And Jung is sort of interpreting this and seeing this as almost like one step in an evolution of God. And God, so Jung's view of God is that God in the Old Testament wasn't always the same, and is sort of growing and changing, and sort of going through this process of sort of self-realization, and this is a sort of critical moment in the development of God. But certainly the God here doesn't, at least what Jung can see, isn't a loving God at all, but is a really scary God. Which I think to a certain point is very, very fair. It might be part of the point of what's written there in Job. And he sort of goes on to sort of to sort of analyze, to psychoanalyze God. And eventually it's essentially then whittled down to this idea that this projection, that this idea of God is a kind of projection, I think. I'm not a psychologist, I don't really understand a lot of the terminology. And that really it's, that this view of God is a way of humanity being able to come to terms with itself and its own barbarism, and its own humanity's own inhumanity, which Jung felt was very pertinent and particularly in the context of 20th century not literature, but in 20th century history, and he eventually put this book out and wrote about these experiences. In I think the 1950s, this came out, I think, or maybe the late 40s, but certainly in the atomic age. And so the dread of what humanity can do and the dark side of humanity was very, very, present in Jung's mind. And so I think that's sort of his interpretation of there being a God that's like a coin, that there's a lighter side and a darker side, and that being an image or a way that humanity can kind of come to terms with itself. And the quibble I had towards the end of the book, whether or not you can call it a quibble, I'm not sure, but what I was wondering at the end of the book is, like, what does Jung really think about God? Like, what kind of God, if at all, does Jung believe in? And he kind of annoys me in the same way that people like Jordan Peterson annoys me. Is that he just keeps things so vague. That there just seem to be so many contradictions. And so he's painted this picture of God being a symbol, and I suppose, real things can also be symbols, so you can maybe believe in God but still say that in a particular text he's symbolic of something. I suppose that that's something you could do. But this is how he ends the book. Let's see where I should start from. So in our experiences, there are no psychic conditions which could be observed through introspection outside the human being. The behaviour of the archetypes cannot be investigated at all without the interaction of the observing consciousness. I think I've started in a weird place, but to be honest, wherever I start it, it's going to be weird. Therefore, the question as to whether the process is initiated by consciousness or by the archetype, or I think what he's talking about there is that symbol of God, the archetype, can never be answered unless, in contradiction to experience, one either robbed the archetype of its autonomy or degraded consciousness to a mere machine. Reading that out loud, are both of those things, well, degrading consciousness to a mere machine? But certainly robbing an archetype of its autonomy. How can something abstract have autonomy? So already I'm having these weird problems with what he's saying. Like, what are you saying, Jung? What are you really meaning? We find ourselves in best agreement with psychological experience if we concede to the archetype as a definite measure of independence, and to consciousness a degree of creative freedom proportionate to its scope. I think eventually we're going to get to the point that I really had a problem with. There then arises that reciprocal action between two relatively autonomous factors, which compels us, when describing and explaining the processes, to present something, the one and sometimes the other factor, as the acting subject, even when God becomes man. The Christian solution has hitherto avoided this difficulty by recognizing Christ as the one and only God-man. And another interpretation that Jung has is that we're all God-men because we've got the Holy Spirit, apparently. But the indwelling of the Holy Ghost, the third divine person in man, brings about a Christification of many. And the question then arises whether these many are all complete God-men. Such a transformation would lead to insufferable collisions between them, to say nothing of the unavoidable inflation to which the ordinary mortal, who is not freed from original sin, would instantly succumb. In all these circumstances, it is well to remind ourselves of St. Paul and his split consciousness. On the one side, he felt that he was the apostle, directly called and enlightened by God, and on the other side, a sinful man who could not pluck out the thorn in the flesh and rid himself of the satanic angel who plagued him. That is to say, even the enlightened person remains what he is, and is never more than his own limited ego before the one, capital O, who dwells within him, whose form has no knowable boundaries, who encompasses him on all sides, fathomless as the abysms of the earth and the vast sky. So a beautiful sentence to end with. But what on earth does he mean? Is this just an idea of God, or does he really believe in this one, capital O, who dwells within him, whose forms has no knowable boundaries? The problem being that he's so vague, and there seems to be an element of self-contradiction there across the whole book, and I think in all of his thinking, because he's not willing to make any real claims. He's not willing to be definitive. Something he does a lot in the book is he will quite often criticize a commonly held view of how we see the world, or a traditional religious view, and then we'll say, now that I've sort of applied my critical rigor to this, and sort of shown you that it's balderdash, very clearly that it's this, because A is a symbol of B and whatever, and you sort of have to be like, well, hold on, who says that A is a symbol of B? Because it's not obvious to me, and you're obviously not applying the same critical rigor that you're giving to trying to unpick your proponent in whatever situation you're finding yourself in. You're not applying that back to yourself, and so that again is something that I find a little annoying in Jung. Is this vagueness, is this lack of complete critical rigor, and ultimately I don't really understand what he thinks, and I'm not comfortable with the idea that it's supposed to be loose and open, and it can be whatever you want it to be. I mean, this is something this is published by Princeton University Press. It's apparently psychology, and it just reads, I don't know, it just doesn't make sense. So I'm sorry that this has gone on for a while, but it did irritate me, because I think I wanted Jung to actually let me know what he thought, and I don't feel like he did that at all. And you don't have to beat people over the head to give a definitive answer on any particular subject. If someone doesn't want to talk about something, then that's fine. However, if you're going to write a book about something, you kind of want to address the subject a little more definitively, maybe. And so yeah, it's just a bit vague and navel-gazy. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there, since we're 45 minutes in. And so I hope this was at least interesting. If you're familiar at all with John Milton or with C.G. Jung, please feel free to give me a comment. If I have, well, I know I have massive gaps in my knowledge, so if you're more knowledgeable than me, please fill me in, or tell me why I'm wrong or why you disagree. I'll be perfectly happy for you to do so. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.